Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to the shop. Today we're going to be going on a bit of a field trip and going off and working on the anchor beam from the Lumberman. This is a ship that sailed the Great Lakes just after the Civil War. It has an amazing history in the woodworking world and a lot of interesting things about it which I might get into in the future. But for right now, let's get to working on the project. This is the anchor from the Lumberman, one of the largest and fastest lumber delivering schooners on the Great Lakes. It was able to carry over 160,000 board feet at one of the fastest ships. It sank just off of the coast of Milwaukee, and the remains you can now actually go see in a museum at Loves Park Scuba. And the wreck was actually found by Captain Dan Johnson, who owns Love Park Scuba. And the old beam from this was falling apart, and he asked me to come and restore it. So I said yes, because this has an amazing history that has to do with the lumber industry, and how much lumber it was able to carry was absolutely phenomenal. And I might actually get into that history sometime in the future in another video here. But today we're actually just going to be making the beam, the post that goes across the anchor. And this is actually the original one. It was made out of oak originally, but sitting on the bottom of Lake Michigan for over 100 years, and it is no longer what it used to be. A drunk driver hit it last year and broke it in half, and so Dan asked me to make a new one. So I was thinking about making it out of oak, but with the time constraints and the work going into it, we decided to actually do it with cedar because we were wanting to just make it look right as opposed to making it historically perfect. So this is a piece of a cedar telephone pole that was untreated, and I need to taper either end down to match the original. It was originally 12 inches in the middle and going down to about 8 inches at either end. And so this means draw knife time! Yay! And it was quite a bit of time with the draw knife, but this actually marches through it pretty quickly. This seasoned cedar, it smells fantastic and it works incredibly well. Until you get to these knots. But for the knots, I just found if I brought in a hatchet, I could chop them out relatively quickly and then get back to work with the draw knife and clean it down. This was incredibly fun. These curls came off quickly and started building up on the floor, and were very enjoyable, as curls can be. So the cedar on this works well, and it will be very rot resistant. This is a very old telephone pole, and you can see the wood underneath is actually phenomenally good. A bit of checking, but nothing that will stop it from lasting a long time more. So we're going to keep tapering this down. You saw earlier how I drew a circle on the one end to get an idea of where it was. And I just kept bringing that taper closer and closer to the middle until we got one end tapered. And then I could flip it around and do the other thing with the other end. And it ended up being about an hour and a half, 2 hours per end to actually get them tapered and shaped down just about what I'm looking for. I want to round over the end so we don't have that sharp corner, so this means bringing in a chisel and lopping off the corners at about 45 degrees, and then I can come in and shape it a little bit more to make it rounded. Once I have it shaped with the chisel, then I can bring in a spoke shave and clean it up and smooth it out. And this was actually really surprising how well the spoke shave cleaned up the cedar cross grain and did phenomenal work. The draw knife left a lot of flat spots and facets, and coming in with the spoke shave allowed me to clean up a lot of those facets, and any particular spots where there were dings or dents I could come in and clean them up and smooth it down and get it very nice and pretty. Now the next thing I need to do is actually cut this in half, because I need to create a mortise on the inside to sandwich the anchor as it is. So we're going to snap a line and start resawing! Yay! Normally I would want to use the frame saw to do this, however there is no way to hold this in a way that I could get the frame saw on it, so I actually have it sitting in the opening of my saw vise, and then I'm just going to use a handsaw and cut all the way down it. And so you cut for a while, and then you rotate it, and then you cut from the other side, and then you rotate it again, and you cut from the other side, and you rotate it again, and you cut from the other side until you get all the way down this thing. It took quite a while to do it. Yeah. And in the end, you'll actually see I cheated. I cut about 3/4 of the way down, and then I ran into some issues and time in order to get this out. I had to actually speed up the process, so I got a circular saw and cut from either side at the far end. So you'll see those marks later on, but the circular saw didn't make it into the video. I thought I recorded it, but apparently not. because that would have always been kind of fun to show that people don't like it when I use circular saws. Oh no. But it was around here that I switched and did the circular saw for the final cut. After that, we can then smooth it flat-ish and get it ready to start cutting the mortise. To do this, we want to actually line things up, and then I want to make a center line on this that goes across both pieces, and this way I can reference a point on both of these that is the exact same. And rather than just having a marker, I decided to cut a mark with a saw, and that made it a little more accurate. I'm also going to need to cut a mortise in an exact depth, and so to do this, I'm going to use a large panel saw and put a piece of tape on there that is the depth I want to cut down, and that will give me a visual indicator of the depth stop. So I have my center line on both of these that is the exact across it, and then I have a template that I actually drew off of the anchor itself, so I had exactly the shape that I needed cut into this. And so with that, we can transfer this shape onto the beam itself, and now I have this shape to cut out. To do this, we need to cut down either side, and I want to cut it down to half the thickness of the anchor, the iron. And so that's why I put the tape on the saw, so I can cut down to that depth. And so I cut across either side of it, and this allows me to keep on going until I notice that we're getting close to the tape. This surprisingly took a lot longer than I expected. It was probably about 4 or 5 minutes per side of this, so it was a decent amount of work to cut down either side of both of these mortises. So whatever I'm doing to this side, I'm also doing to the other side. And then very carefully chopping out the middle in between, making sure not to hit myself. Yes, I know I am chiseling towards myself, but I needed a way to hold it in place while I chiseled. There you can see the other one I'm working on as well. And so I could do some of it sitting across and chopping across, but to actually get the strength in, I needed to chop between my legs, which scares a lot of people, but as long as you're careful, it's actually not that big of a deal. You need to be careful when cutting in here. You can see in some of these, the log is starting to split out because there's a check that runs out from there, so I need to be very careful when pounding in, not to pound it too hard. We're going to flush out the whole bottom and make sure that this mortise then fits into the pattern that I drew. Nice snug fit, a little bit tighter than it needed to be, but now that we have it on site, we can clean it up and make it fit perfectly. So I'm going to wiggle it in there and make sure it's fitting. In this case, it's not quite going in all the way, but the anchor is going to mark the inside of it, and so I can pull these off and then use the chisel to mark down the side. So once they are on most of the way, we can take them off and clean up any spots where I see marks left on them from the anchor itself. And then we can put them back on and check it again. I did this 2 or 3 times until it got in there, until eventually it popped in there, and I can pull them together and bango, they're all the way together. I'm really happy. And you can start to see how this anchor then comes together. Now that it's shaped and in place, we can start doing some protection on it. Because this is cedar, it's a fairly porous wood, and I'm actually going to be using some of the Total Boat penetrating epoxy. This will soak into the wood and protect it really well. For some of the harder woods, I might use the sealer, but this epoxy works really well. Here you can actually see the circular saw lines where I cut either side, and then I still had to resaw in between it, but it saved me a good chunk of time, kind of like a curving plane, but in a circular form. So we're going to coat either side of this on the inside. That way we can then lock it together, and we'll coat the other side, we'll coat the outside later once this has been bolted together. So we can lift these up, put them in place, and now we can start putting in some holes. Now because this used to be a telephone pole, there were a couple holes in it already, and I lined those up so that we could use those holes to actually bolt this together. Originally it was put together with rivets, and I was thinking about doing that, but in the end, due to the time getting it out, we just decided to go with a threaded rod. So the rod goes through and then has a washer on either side and bolts it. And here you're actually going to see hex nuts. We did eventually get square nuts because they look a lot better, but we only had hex nuts at this time before I could get the video out. So I have an incredibly long 3/4 inch auger bit to go all the way through. Yay! Squeaky, squeaky, squeaky. But we drill this all the way through 3 holes on either side, and then we can put the threaded rod through it. This was a good bit of work, but with a good auger bit, it goes relatively quickly. Unfortunately, this wasn't a great auger bit, but it did work rather well. So we're going to put it all the way through, put a nut and washer on one side, and then put a nut and washer on the other side, thread it all the way down, and tighten it in place. Once it has been tightened in place, then we can cut off the excess. And this way we have the bolt exactly the length it needs to be, because as this tapers, each of these are slightly different. And so we ended up using a little bit shy of 6 feet worth of 3/4 threaded rod. Yay! Hacksaw time. Now we can cut those off. Oh, I need to do the ones at the top. And these ones were a little more difficult because it was up over my head. And I didn't have a really good way of putting a ladder up there. But with a little bit of time, a little bit of patience, they all come in. And it was actually, I was kind of fearing this with having to drill the holes and cut the rod on site. But surprisingly, with a good hacksaw blade, it cut through it relatively quickly. And didn't take much time at all, so I was very happy with how that came. Again, we're replacing these hex nuts with square nuts, and they'll make it look a little bit sharper. Now it's that done, we can pull it apart, and I let it all sit for a little while, let the epoxy cure, and then we can come back through, and I'm going to do the final trimming on it. Any of the little bits of smoothing that have to go on, making these seams actually line up because they shifted ever so slightly. So we can bring in the draw knife, clean that up, any epoxy that's squeezed out, and then smooth it all down with the spoke shave. Clean it all up and get it as clean looking as we can, because we're going to be getting into the finish. Now, one of the things we wanted to do for this was we wanted it to be dark, like the original beam had been weathered underneath the water for 100 years. And so I'm going to be using a Minwax ebony black stain. And we're going to work this in. Unfortunately, I ran out of gloves, and every store in town was also out of gloves, so yeah, we're going to leave up some stains on my hands for a little bit. Eventually I realized, wait a second, I've got some grocery bags, and so I wrapped those around my hand and continued the staining work. Yeah, I ended up getting it all over my hand anyways, because the bags eventually ripped and started leaking, and yeah. It stains your hands really nicely, just so you know. But this actually provided the black look that Dan was looking for, and looked a lot like the original, just not quite as weather-worn as being underneath the water for 100 years. Now we can put on the final coat of penetrating epoxy, let that soak in, and then put on some marine-grade varnish. We're using the Total Boat Gleam varnish to go onto this, and that will give it that nice, shiny texture, the glossy look that we're looking for. And there it is. I am really, really happy with how this came out, and Dan is happy too, and that is what is really important. You can keep showing off this piece of history for a long, long time to come. So there you have it. This is a really, really cool thing that I'm kind of excited about this. I'm in love with the idea of, well, number one, it's at a scuba diving shop, which I enjoy. I like history. It is the Lumberman. It's part of the local history. It has a great woodworking tradition to it. And it was an interesting project to try something a little bit different and play around. So I hope you like this. It's a little bit different. If you would like to see a video dedicated to the history of the Lumberman, I might do that in the future, because there are some very interesting things about it and how it sank and what all went into it. So if you'd like to hear about that, let me know in the comments down below. Also, if you have any other ideas, comments, concerns, thoughts, things I could have done better, let me know those down below as well. And I do want to say thank you to all of the patrons on Patreon, everyone scrolling over here on the side, the people who've clicked the join button down below. You are helping making Wood by Wright happen and allow these videos to keep on coming. So thank you for that. Without patrons and members, Wood by Wright would not be here. If you do ever happen to meet anyone scrolling over to the side, tell them thank you. I think that'll about do it for now. And until next time, have a wonderful day. Every good TV show needs an anchor host. I've got the anchor, now I gotta figure out how to host it.